Today we're going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, sanding. Yay! I usually gloss over all the sanding steps in my videos because it's just a long, boring, annoying task, but it really is one of the most important steps. A bad sanding job can completely ruin a few weeks worth of work. So today I'll go through everything you need to know to take your sanding to the next level. Let's jump right in and talk about sandpaper. When shopping for the stuff, you'll find it's sold by the grit. 80 grit, 120 grit, 400 grit. These are standardized numbers to help you choose the right paper for the job. 60 grit is very coarse and 220 is very fine. So the lower the number is, the coarser the paper will be, and the higher the number is, the finer the paper will be. This has to do with the material that's used as the abrasive for these papers. If you look closely, the particles on this 80 grit paper are very large, and the particles on this 220 paper are very small. So 80 grit sandpaper means that roughly 80 abrasive particles fit across 1 inch, while 220 means that 220 particles will fit across that same inch. What does this mean practically? Larger, rougher particles will remove more material quickly, but it will not leave a smooth finish because those large particles make large gouges in the wood. Smaller, finer particles will take a longer time to remove material, but it will leave a really nice finish. That's why we always work our way up through the grits when we're sanding. Before I walk you through my whole process, I'm going to give you a warning. A good sanding job on a piece of furniture will basically take a whole day. It's a very long, laborious process, and with every project, I always seem to forget how long it actually takes. Woodworker's amnesia, as I like to call it. Every project is different, and there are exceptions to the rule, but my typical sanding progression is 80, 120, 180, and then most of the time 220. That'll depend on what finish I'm using. Usually the cans of finish will tell you what grit to sand to, so that part's easy to figure out, but it's the steps in between which may be a bit confusing. A rule of thumb is to never skip more than 1 grit. So I've laid out all the available grits from 80 to 220 here. There's 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, and finally 220. So if you start with 80, you can skip over 1, which is 100, and go straight to 120. But you should not skip over 2 and go straight to 150. From 120, you can skip another one, which is 150, to get to 180, and so on. I'll show you an example here. I'll start with 80 grit and I'll go across the grain so you can see it better, but don't sand like this. When you look closely, you can see these scratches in the wood, which feel rough. Now I'll skip to 180, going with the grain, and we'll see what happens. You can still see those scratches left over from the 80 grit paper. Now, it is possible to remove the scratches from 80 grit sandpaper by skipping too many grits, but it'll just take you a really long time to do it. If you keep rubbing, eventually you'll remove enough material to get below the scratches, but you'll just hate sanding even more. So let me show you an example doing it the correct way. Starting with 80, you see the same scratches as before, but I'll only skip 1 grit and I'll go to 120. And as you can see, those deep scratches from the 80 grit are disappearing. But there are new scratches from the 120 paper that need to be removed, so I'll go to the next grit in the progression, 180. This is super important for every project, but it's really noticeable when you use stain. If you skip too many grits, the rough, deep gouges from the lower grit paper won't be removed properly in some areas, and the stain will absorb differently all across your workpiece, leaving a blotchy, uneven-looking piece. Here's a sample piece sanded correctly, and here's a sample piece where I skipped from 80 to 220. You don't want your projects to look like this. So working your way up through the grits without skipping more than 1 grit is the way to go. Now, I don't normally hand sand my projects. I take advantage of modern technology and use one of these. This is a random orbital sander, but there are lots of sander options out there. A random orbital sander is the best type of sander for all-purpose sanding. It handles rough, lower grit sanding to remove material quickly, and it can handle finish sanding as well. It's called a random orbital sander because it combines spinning and orbiting to give a random pattern, which reduces the swirls or pigtails that you could get with these motorized sanders. If you're in the market for one of these, you'll see they typically come in either 5-inch or 6-inch. I prefer the 6-inch because it can cover more surface area in one pass, but if your budget only allows for a 5-inch, the 5-inch sanders work great too, and they're lighter. More important than the size of the sanding pad is the orbit diameter. Many random orbital sanders allow you to choose how large the orbit will be. This can be anywhere from 2.5 millimeters or 3/32 to 8 millimeters, which is a 5/16 stroke. The larger the stroke, the more aggressive the sander will be, which means it removes material faster but leaves a rougher finish. The smaller the stroke, the finer the finish, but it cuts through wood at a slower pace because it's moving in smaller circles. So finished sanders usually have a 2.5 or 3/32 stroke, while sanders with an 8 millimeter or 5/16 stroke are meant for more aggressive stock removal. If you're only getting one sander, I think the happy medium is a 5 millimeter or 3/16 stroke because it has a good balance between material removal and finish quality. It hits that Goldilocks zone where the size of the orbit is big enough that rough sanding won't take forever, and the orbit is small enough that your surface will still feel super smooth. If you really want to get into high-end finishing though, you'll eventually want to get a finish sander with a smaller stroke, but you do not need one right away. Okay, so basics are covered. Now let's sand the project. Someone glued up this panel and forgot to add caul, so these boards are not even with each other. Before we work on making this panel smooth, we need to work on making it flat. This is where the 80 grit sandpaper comes in. And even though this 80 grit sandpaper will cut through material very quickly because the particles are large, this first grit is still always the longest step in the sanding process. I'll start by making pencil lines on the panel, and this will help me visualize where I've already sanded. First, I'll put on some PPE. Now just make your way across the piece very, very, very slowly. One common mistake is moving the sander too fast. If you rush, the pad doesn't spend enough time on each spot, and it's not doing its job. Going too fast may also lead to unwanted swirl marks. The trick is to let the sander do the work. Guide it slowly and evenly, and don't push down too hard. And you want to do overlapping passes here. Like I just sanded 6 inches worth of material, but when I go to do the next line, I'll overlap the first pass probably at the halfway mark, maybe slightly less. You just don't want to start the next row all the way up here. After you sanded the whole board, you pick the sander up and then turn it off. Do not turn it off while it's on the panel. Now inspect. I can see that there are still pencil lines here, meaning these boards are still not even with each other and this panel is not flat yet. You may be tempted to just focus on sanding on that area until those pencil lines go away and the two parts are even. And you may even see people on YouTube use their sanders on edge like this to remove material quickly, but then your board won't be flat and there's going to be a divot right in that spot that you focused on. So put some more pencil lines on and repeat 80 grit again. I told you this first step is the longest in the whole process. To ensure you have the flattest board possible, all you have to do is keep repeating this step until you've sanded all the pencil away while moving in slow, even, overlapping passes. All the pencil lines are gone now, so now I'll inspect the board for any unwanted swirl marks. The best way to do this is with a raking light. So you shine a light on the side and you just pass it along the board and you inspect it for any of those pigtail swirlies. I mentioned before not to press down too hard during this process because if you use too much pressure on the sander, it stops the pad from being able to spin correctly, and that causes a few different problems. First, it heats up the pad, which can melt the hook and loop backing that holds the paper on, and you don't want to have to deal with that. Secondly, using too much pressure causes those little pigtail swirls to happen because the pad is not moving the way that it's supposed to. The best way to avoid the swirlies altogether is by using light pressure. But in case they show up, just do a quick little hand sand using the grit that's currently on your sander in the direction of the grain, and they should come out pretty easily. Another super important step to prevent swirlies and scratches is to clean off your work between every grit. So we are ready for 120 now. We need to make sure to remove all the dust left over from the lower grit, or those large particles may get stuck in the sandpaper and can cause some unwanted scratches. The best way to prevent this from happening is to have a good dust extraction system. A lot of hand sanders come with little dust ports to try and collect all the dust, but in my opinion, they really don't work so well. When I first started, I also hooked up my sander to a regular shop vac, and that was okay, but not great either. If you really want to step up your sanding game, I think having a dust extractor is the way to go. Shop vacs and dust extractors may look the same, but they're not. There's a lot of technical jargon I can get into, but here's a simple explanation. Shop vacs are great for picking up large debris on the floor, while dust extractors are designed to pull fine dust straight from the tool you're using. I have been using this 3M Extract Clean Sanding System for, I think, around 2 years now, and I was holding off on sharing my opinion on it until I put it through its paces. After a couple of years, I can honestly say that I would recommend it. One of my favorite features is that it automatically cleans the filters when you turn it on. So you know it's running at peak performance before you even start sanding. The sander is lightweight and easy to hold, and the dust extraction on it is amazing, especially when I use it with this Extract Cubitron sandpaper. This is my favorite sandpaper. See all these little holes here? The pattern's designed in such a way where it leaves a virtually dust-free surface. It pulls dust through all these little holes, which keep the abrasive from clogging and keeps the sanding pad cooler. It's amazing when it comes to the finished quality on my pieces, but maybe slightly more important, it reduces all the airborne dust so my shop is cleaner and I'm working in a safer environment. With this system, you're able to consistently get a high-quality surface, and I've noticed that the paper cuts faster and lasts longer than a lot of the other discs that I've used. With some of the other papers I've tried that I won't name, I constantly have to stop mid-sanding to swap discs because they lose their cutting power too quickly. With the Extract system, the discs stay sharp way longer and cut quicker. So that means I spend less time sanding, and I know we all want that. So if you're looking to upgrade your sanding setup, explore the 3M Extract Clean Sanding System for yourself by using the links down below. All right, your board is flat and it should be smooth sailing from here as we make our way up through the grits. You can do the whole pencil mark thing again and make sure you're keeping the board flat as you're making your way up. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. That depends on the project and which part I'm sanding on that project. The bottom side of the bottom of a cabinet, yeah, I'm not gonna put as much time into that section, but while I'm talking about sections, the order of operations when it comes to sanding is also super important. Like, I wouldn't glue up a whole cabinet and then start the sanding process. Usually, I do a lot of sanding before final assembly, like the inside of a cabinet that I won't be able to reach after it's glued up. And even the outsides, it's always easier to sand a project before it's assembled, so I'll usually sand all parts to one grit below my final grit of choice, then do the final grit after it's all assembled. All those details make all the difference, but all those details will be different on every project you or I do. So you just have to use a little bit of common sense when it comes to those types of things and figure out what will work best for your project. That's also something that just comes with experience. As you build more, you'll just get the hang of when these operations are supposed to be done. Also, something that comes with time and experience is knowing when to stop sanding. The higher the grit, the smoother the finish. So why not go all the way up to 600 or even higher? Well, I thought that when I first started, and I sanded a project to a super high grit because it just felt so good and it felt like glass. And then I went to put on stain and it looked awful. The stain was so uneven and it just wouldn't penetrate in certain areas. I had no idea what was going on, but that was a lesson learned the hard way. If you sand too high, you're basically closing off the pores of the wood. That can prevent certain stains or finishes from soaking in properly. Here's a piece that was sanded to 120, and here's a piece that was sanded to 1000. This feels super nice and smooth, but at what cost? I'll put some stain on both of the pieces, and as you can see, the stain absorbs into the piece that was sanded to 120, but it mostly just sits on top of the 1000 grit sanded piece because it can't absorb into the wood. The pores are just closed up too much for stain to penetrate well. It's the same thing for finishes that sit on top of the wood, like spray lacquer or poly. Sanding too high could prevent proper adhesion of these finishes because the wood becomes too slick for it to latch onto those wood fibers properly. So for spray lacquer or polyurethane, you really don't want to go higher than 120 or 180. And these finishes build up on top of each other, and it's the finish itself that's going to create the smooth feel in the end, not the actual wood. During the finishing process, you'll want to sand with high grit in between coats, but finishing is a whole other video topic. When it comes to penetrating oil finishes, you want to sand a little bit higher, like to 220, because you'll actually be feeling the wood when it's all cured. But you don't want to sand too high or the oil won't be able to penetrate. Again, usually the cans of finish tell you what grit you should sand to, so the guesswork when to stop is usually taken out once you decide what finish to use. And it's always a smart idea to do a test piece before you start on your project once you figure out what finish you want to use. Here's a fun way to do a test. Take a scrap from your project, sand the whole board up through the grits starting with 80 and ending in 120. Now section it off with higher grits, and you can put your finish of choice on the whole board to see which section looks and feels the best. There are definitely some times when you don't want to follow what it says on the can. I know there are always exceptions to the rule, like when it comes to end grain. You may or may not be aware, but end grain absorbs more finish than face or edge grain. This block of wood was once part of a living tree outside, and the purpose of this chunk of wood was to take water from the tree's roots and bring it all the way up to the leaves and flowers. Think of it like the wood's own plumbing system, but now it just soaks up your finish instead of watering leaves. So why does this matter? On this sample, the whole board was sanded to 120, including the end grain. And when I spray it with water, you can see the end grain is absorbing more water than the face grain. When it comes to finishes, this leads to end grain looking darker than the rest of the board. This could be a really big problem if you're using stain and you want a consistent look. Let's use what we know about the process of sanding to solve this. We know when you sand to higher grits, it will close the pores of the wood more and it'll lead to less absorption of finish. So the solution here is to sand the end grain to a higher finish to close the pores just enough so it absorbs finish at the same rate as the face and edge grain. But how much higher? I usually go about 2 grits higher than my finished grit. So if I sand it to 180, I'll probably go to 320 on the end grain. And if I sand it to 220, I'll probably go up to like 400 on the end grain. But again, that's project dependent, and it's not something that I always do. It's just something to be aware of. Like I said earlier, it helps to make a sample piece, especially if you're going to use stain. Another issue that may arise when you start to put finish on, grain raising. So you did everything right, sanded from 80 to 220 without skipping more than 1 grit. You have excellent dust extraction, inspected between every pass. You were patient and went super slow without using too much pressure, and your project feels like butter. Then you put on a coat of finish and it feels rough and fuzzy, and you're like, I just wasted a whole day of my life. If that's ever happened to you, here's what's going on. Wood is made up of tiny little fibers, and when you're sanding, you're actually smushing those fibers down. That's why the surface feels so smooth, because the fibers are pressed down flat. But when you put on certain finishes, especially water-based ones, those fibers soak up the moisture, swell, and pop back up, and that's what creates that rough, fuzzy texture you feel. The easiest way to prevent this is to raise the grain on purpose before you apply your finish. So after you get to your final grit, let's say 220 as an example, simply spray the wood with water and wipe off the excess. You don't want it soaking wet, just a very light coating of water. Then let it dry, and once dry, you'll definitely feel those fuzzies. So just kick them back with a very light sanding using your final grit. In this case, it was 220. After that, when you put on your finish, the grain won't rise again because all those fibers that wanted to stand up already have, and you sanded them off, which gives a much smoother final finish. I know some people who raise the grain on every project, no matter what finish they use, and some people who only do it when they're using water-based finishes. And there are some people who only do it on cutting boards because it's an item that gets wet when you wash it, so raising the grain beforehand is just a smart move. There's no right or wrong way here. It's just the process that works for you and the finishes you like to use. That's all just something that comes with time. Everything that I just said was in regard to working with hardwoods. It's what I work with the most, so it's what I have the most experience to talk about. But briefly, if you're working with softer woods like pine or fir, whatever this is, you wouldn't want to start sanding at 80 grit. It's just way too rough for soft woods. So I would start with 100 or even 120 in that case. Plywood is also another story as well. You don't want to sand plywood too much because you may sand through the super thin veneer, and you wouldn't want to start with anything lower than 120, but 220 is a good number for plywood in my opinion. All right, so I think that's all I got for an intro to sanding, and I think I covered a lot of ground. I hope this cleared up any confusion anyone had with the sanding process, and I hope this helps with your future projects. Like I said, there are definitely best practices, but as you progress, you'll start to get a deeper understanding of what works for you and the finishes that you like to use, and you'll come up with your own routine that looks different than mine or anyone else's, and that's okay as long as it works for you and you're proud of the projects that you turn out. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.